Half a day from Guam. My name is Jackie Marathi, and I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Corporate Social Responsibility Officer for Bank of Guam. I am very humbled and very honored to be a part of this panel on climate and environmental justice. The individuals that are going to be joining me this morning include Fakhri Karim, Director, Partnership Development, Janine Grant Consulting, Ruth Santiago, Trustee from Earth Justice, Hernan Silva, Ciudadanos y Clima, ONG member and Climate Reality Leadership Core Mentor, Ili Masivesi, Project Manager and Capacity Building Advisor, Oxfam in the Pacific, and Linda Siegel, Loss and Damage Advisor, AOS-IS. We welcome all of the audience members, and I just want to review some of the logistical details of the session. Hosted on Zoom, all audiences will be muted without camera. Any questions, please put them in the Q&A section, identify yourselves with your name and country, and indicate who your question is addressed to. And then I will read those audience questions directly to you. The session will be recorded and live streamed onto Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Before we begin, here is a quick poll on where you all are from. So if you could answer and choose one selection, we would really appreciate it. Christian? Please let us know where you're watching from and select which region you are calling in from. Thank you. Clearly, the Pacific is coming in at about 50%, which we expected because we're streaming from the Pacific island of Guam, followed very closely as well by the Caribbean, North America, and Asia. So thank you very much for letting us know where you're coming from. This also helps in terms of directing and framing our upcoming island innovation topics. It is my great honor to, first of all, introduce Fakhri Karim, who's the Director, Partnership Development from Janine Grant Consulting. Please help me to welcome Fakhri.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Thank you very much, Jackie. Good morning, everyone, in everywhere, every corner of the world. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Yes. First, thank you very much for this opportunity to be part of this very interesting discussion. To start, I would like. I was inspired by the island story shared by Louis Ellis on the first day of the summit. I don't know if all of us have a chance to listen to the story. A very interesting story on what happened to the Changoshan many years back. Based on the story, there are at least two key points I'd like to bring to this discussion, which is fit to our climate and environment justice island perspective as the topic today. First, islands, that how people of Changoshan were moved from their homeland, their beautiful island, to other countries, will had huge impact on their future life. The second, island, that the decision to move was not made by the Changoshan itself. So then it creates many injustice in their community. So speaking on climate change, environment justice from the island perspective, I think we all should be worried the same story will be repeated as the consequence of the climate change. When we look at those island countries who are facing, we are in the front line facing the climate change impact and risk, the risk is beyond what other countries are facing right now. So if we fail to live up with our agreement, what we agreed in Paris Agreement, to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees, some of those island countries, especially small atoll countries in the Pacific and in other archipelago, will risk to lose their land, their heritage, or their culture. So if this climate change will force them to lose land, cultures, and then gradually they have to move. And if they have to move, they will lose the countries as the climate change refugees will cause a lot more injustice in their community. I still remember Honorable Sabaga, who was the Prime Minister of Tuvalu at the time, in one of his speeches during the UNFCCC COP21 in Paris, saying, if you want to see what climate change brings to the world, put your feet in our shoes. I think what he meant here that small island countries facing the worst climate change impact compared to others. The irony is they are not the one who caused this problem. This brings me to the other issues from Mr. Louis' story about who make decision on what to do and how. So bringing that issues into climate change justice, besides so many efforts, global efforts, I mean, to push the action strategy that to be done by the island countries, the big question is, what resources have been channeled to their national or local government to empower them to address the problem they are facing? Local government who are in the front line as facing the climate change risk in the small island countries, most of the time, they don't have enough capacity, they don't have enough resources, and they do not have enough power, and there's not empowered to deal with this, to help their own community. Based on my experience in some countries in Pacific, local government will be able to play their role very well in the if they have enough power, capacity, and resources. A few years back, I was with UNCDF, and we worked together with the government of Tuvalu. We set up a system and a mechanism to allow to put the resources to local government in Tuvalu. This is a kind of performance-based grant we designed to allow the national government transfer its own to local government to Tuvalu. The local government there called Capules is very small. And then that will allow Capules to plan the grant at the top up to their development budget, to plan and implement it in their own strategic way to improve the resilience of the island. This kind of initiative gives them the right to decide and act on their own good, which is, I believe, is an important part of the climate justice. The last issues that I'd like to bring into discussion is, which I think should be part of the climate change justice, is how indigenous and traditional knowledge will be included and used as part of the effort to mitigate or adapt to the climate change effects. As a global issue, climate change has become a global agenda, and then every country is to react upon on. For the island countries, climate change challenges are unique, with the specific challenge they have, and they have their own specific experience and expertise in dealing with that over generation. How well does the global agenda accommodate that indigenous experience? That's another question. I remember once when I was in Vanuatu, together with other international colleagues from international organizations, was in the meeting with community Vanuatu explaining about climate change adaptation strategies and action plan that they should do. Every one of us from international organizations have a lot to say in that meeting, until one community leader said that they were not really familiar to what had been said, but they do have their long experience in dealing with cyclone, monsoon, flooding, and other climate risks happening in their area. And he asked us that, could that be considered as one of the options as part of the biggest discussion on this adaptation strategy? So indigenous knowledge comes from the real experience from the local community, which can be a local solution to a global issues. But have we given them enough room to play their role in relation to climate change and mitigation or adaptation framework that already exists? And which we ask the government to report again So I think this is another aspect of the climate environment justice that should be discussed in this forum. Again, thank you very much to the Island Innovations and the Island Virtual Summit Committee for the opportunity to take part in this discussion. I'm really looking forward to discuss a bit more with all participants from everywhere in every corner of the world. Thank you very much, Jackie.
Thank you so much, Fakhri. I think your presentation raises a lot of questions, in particular, not only the individuals that, that are moving from one country to another, but also what rights will and privileges will climate refugees have in the areas they migrate to, are going to be more and more raised as refugees and movements get greater attention in the spotlight. So, but definitely, thank you so much for your presentation. We look forward also to hearing questions and answers directed to you. Our next speaker, I am so honored again to introduce, is Ruth Santiago. Ruth is the trustee of Earth Justice. Everyone, please help me to welcome Ruth Santiago. Ruth.
Hello, everyone. As Jackie mentioned, I'm on the board of the Earth Justice, and also I work with community and environmental groups in Puerto Rico, where I'm located, and also serve on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, recently created by the Biden administration, or created earlier this year. So I want to share some slides on my presentation, which is basically about environmental and climate justice and energy democracy in Puerto Rico, where I do most of my work. And so, like many island jurisdictions, unfortunately.
Would you mind adding that on full screen mode?
Sure. As soon as I am able to figure out how to do that, I will. But I think there's a...
it's the icon next to the Zoom, where you see the 52% and the slider, the icon to the left, below.
Sorry, I'm really not good at this.
Yeah, to the left, there's an icon that, no. If you go to the left, that one, yes.
Okay, great. Perfect. Sorry about that. All righty, okay. So just really quickly, as in many islands, unfortunately, a lot of our electric power generation is based on fossil fuels for most of the archipelago. So 97%, over 97% of the power generation in Puerto Rico comes from fossil fired power plants. We have a coal plant and various oil burning power plants, which is very common on islands. And also the largest single source of energy generation in Puerto Rico is so-called natural gas, methane gas. And this, of course, creates communities near these plants that are overburdened by the impacts of fossil fire generation, which include air emissions, but also there's an energy and water nexus that is critical here. And for example, in these two photos, these are the plants that are in southeastern Puerto Rico, where I'm located, and they both extract large amounts of water from what is known as the South Coast Aquifer, which is the only source of potable water for many of those communities in southeastern Puerto Rico. They also discharge huge amounts of heated water into the nearby bay and affect the Caribbean Sea and the marine ecosystem. And so this, of course, has just a general description of the economic, fiscal, climate crisis and the earthquakes and the COVID-19 pandemic that we've had in Puerto Rico in the recent years. And Puerto Rico's development model started many of you may know, with a rapid industrialization process in the late 40s, early 50s that was centered on tax exemptions and other incentives for private investment. Unfortunately, the economic model has resulted in very high unemployment rates compared to the rest of the US, and certain environmental justice communities even greater than that, very high poverty rates, again, compared to the US, and critically also the second or third highest electric rate of any US jurisdiction. Plus, many of you know that Puerto Rico is in a semi-bankrupt status, and that the debt that, for example, the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority has accumulated is mostly related to the import of fossil fuels. There's been, understandably, mass migration of over 700,000 people since about 2006, which accelerated, obviously, after Hurricane Maria in 2017. And even within Puerto Rico, there are regions, areas like the Guayama region in southeastern PR that are have higher poverty and unemployment rates. And so I want to jump to what we consider to be the solution for the energy system in Puerto Rico. And you might want to call it Puerto Rico's Energy Green New Deal. And it has to do with empowering local communities to participate in the electric system as what are known as prosumers, that is, energy producers, not just passive consumers. And also, it has to do with the lessons learned, especially after Hurricane Maria, that disasters exacerbated by the climate crisis have destroyed over and over again in the past 30 years the electric grid, that is the transmission and distribution system that especially runs from southern Puerto Rico, those sacrifice zones, environmental justice communities, to the north, especially to the San Juan metro area. And so people are more aware, certainly, that they must become energy literate and implement energy efficiency and otherwise participate in the electric system, and that we need a radical transformation of, in both terms of the technology and the governments of the Puerto Rico electric system. And Puerto Rico has, at this very moment, it's a critical time, it has the opportunity to use FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, disaster recovery funds to rebuild the electric system in a way that allows the electric power utility and organized communities and local renewable energy contractors to emphasize and build out, especially on-site or rooftop solar and battery energy storage systems. And that is what we're calling basically Puerto Rico's Energy Green New Deal. There's a civil society proposal that you can read at this website, www.queremosolpr.com, that we put together after Hurricane Maria, but had been thinking about and working on for many years prior, that promotes both the technological transformation to especially rooftop solar and storage, energy efficiency, demand response, and other alternatives to the centralized fossil-fired generation and transmission and distribution system that we currently have. And so the question is, will Puerto Rico rebuild the existing system with these centralized plants, fossil-fired plants, and transmission running mostly from the south coast through the central mountain range and the forest into the northern part of Puerto Rico and the San Juan metropolitan area? Or will the government of Puerto Rico and the federal government listen to civil society groups and actually invest the historic amount of FEMA funds being proposed, at least 9.6 billion with a B, and up to 14 billion in an electric system that actually serves the public needs in the archipelago of Puerto Rico? and in that way achieve some measure of environmental justice and climate justice. And I'm not sure if my time is up, but those are my slides.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruth. Guam being in the Micronesia region, we're also part of Typhoon Alley. And so the recurrence of very severe storms is something we're accustomed to, and so it's building and rebuilding. But at what point, like Puerto Rico, do we decide that the old systems have not worked and that the new systems need to be not only studied and discussed, but actually put into action? So thank you for that, and we look forward to some of the questions that will be raised your way. I'm very honored also to now introduce Hernan Silva, Ciudadanos y Clima ONG member and Climate Reality Leadership Corps mentor. Hernan, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Jackie, for the invitation and for the whole group of Island Innovation. I'm so pleased to be part of this group now, this panel, and I'm going to share the screen so I can go for my presentation. Oh, I work for the ONG Ciudadanos y Clima, who is located in Tierra del Fuego, which is the extreme south of South America. And my name is Hernan Silva Borges. The island we're talking about, it's listed in the 100 largest islands of the world. And it's the 28th biggest island in the world. There it says Isla Grande, and it's in the extreme south of South America, as you can see here in this image. And that's the territory where we wanted to talk to. And it's very related with the continent, but also with the oceans, but at the same time with the Antarctic. So it has a very, very interesting relation. The territory we work with is a binational territory. So it's shared by Chile and Argentina. And it also has, it's been blessed by two major oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. And also the extension of the island, the whole extension is 74,000 square kilometers. It's 42,000 kilometers, the biggest islands, and all the rest are fjords and hundreds of islands. And also has two ocean main corridors, the corridors of Magallanes in the north and Beagle in the south. And at the same time, it has 3 protected areas, 3 protected parks, 2 are nationals and 1 is private. So there's a very large concentration of biodiversity and beautiful landscapes there. And as you can see, it's a very low, the population of the island is very low. Only 4 middle and small towns on the territory, 2 in the 1 in the north, 1 in the center, and 2 in the south. Our ONG, as it's very new, we started working since 3 years ago. And what do we do there? What do we do in this beautiful territory? We work to sensibilize people. We want to inform, educate. We make people participate, and we want to influence in the local community, but not only with the people, but also with the authorities and the private sector. How do we do this? We work on the territories with the communities. We work with local, regional, and national organizations. We work with the universities and all the investigators there and the scientists. And we work with Aboriginal representatives. And we also create a 1-year momentum. So we do a year colloquium, and now you're all invited. We're going to have our 3rd colloquium now in November of this year. Also, we work very inclusively with everybody around. And why do we do this? We want to help tackle climate change, as all of you are doing and working now here too. We want to help tackle biodiversity loss climate justice, and conservation, since we're working on a territory where the natural treasure, it's very huge. But I want to make a point with the sensibilization issue. Or we're talking about a territory where there's lots of water, there's a very impressive biodiversity, there's oceans all over, but at the same time, we know that it's not going to last forever. And since we know it's not going to last forever, we bring people in. Most of the members of our group come from different points of Chile, central Chile and northern Chile, where the reality of nature is not the same. You can see in these pictures where some of the members of our group live and work with, where the water access, it's already gone, where the mining industry, it's destroying the glaciers and the mountains and drying the rivers and drying the lakes. And as part of our strategy, we work with all the Aboriginal groups and towns and communities from that area, and so they all have representatives and they all have their knowledge. They've been there in this territory for more than 10,000 years. So we are very sure that we have a lot to learn from them. These are images from our first colloquium, where you can see we start to sensibilize kids and also the communities. On the bottom line of this presentation, there's a link where you can see the information from the colloquium number 1 and colloquium number 2. Another big things we just have done in the region is that we help the governor of the region to declare climate emergency and an environmental emergency. This is the first region in Chile that did that. He did it on August 10th. It was one day right after the IPCC report was liberated for the global community. That's a big issue in the country, and now all the governors want to do the same. We also living in a very important national moment. Chile is changing its constitution, and we think it's a great opportunity to make a constitution to be green, to be ecological, to be human right based, to be multinational, to be pluricultural. As you can see there on the right, on the left hand side, there's two organizations, the SCAC and the CSM, two organizations that gather communities and people and get connected with the constitutional group who's changing the Constitution of Chile, and we are working very close to them. As a final message, I just would like to say that to declare a climate emergency and an environmental emergency, it's a main topic. It's something that puts communities and regions and countries to work together to make the big changes rapidly. And that's why we have this image. We're working now with more declarations here in Chile, and now building the plans and following the plans and the goals that the declaration are they had to do with. And on the other hand, to work with for the climate justice, not tomorrow, but now. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And this is my presentation.
Thank you so much, Hernan. This two items particularly spoke to me. I think the notion of completely redoing your constitution offers Chile an amazing opportunity to really be a leader in the world for this. And so we're going to be keeping a close eye on that. The other notion that you raised was the idea of the native inhabitants who have the most experience, if you will, with solutions, because they've been dealing with the solutions for hundreds and thousands of years. Here in Guam, too, and in Micronesia, part of what we're looking at is also the ability of herbal plants and medications that can help the world heal in ways that are not quite as traditional as we may have been looking at. So thank you again for your presentation. I think that a lot of questions come from you and your organization, certainly. It's my pleasure. You're very welcome. It's my pleasure now to introduce Ili Masavesi, who is the project manager and capacity building advisor for Oxfam in the Pacific. Ili, welcome again, and we look forward to your talk, and let's welcome Ili. Thank you.
Ili, you're muted.
You're muted again, Ili. Ili? Ili, can you hear me? You are muted again, so you have to mute your microphone.
Yes, you are muted.
Okay,
Okay.
that's good.
Excellent. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Jackie and Bulavinaka from the islands of Fiji. I want to thank you all for having me today, especially to the team at Island Innovations and their sponsors who have worked incredibly hard to put together this wonderful summit. I'm honored to be holding this space alongside my fellow speakers, Fakri Karim, Ruth Santiago, Hanan Silva, and Linda Siegal. I want to begin by stating that as custodians of our resources, we hold our island homes and the Pacific Ocean that surrounds them in trust for future generations, as ancestors have done for generations before us. As Pacific Islanders, we recognize existing traditional systems that help to promote, foster, and encourage the voices of the marginalized and vulnerables in our communities to challenge existing climate narratives. At Oxfam, our understanding of climate justice is impacted by a number of things. Firstly, we recognize, as does the scientific community, that climate change is driven by human activity. Secondly, we recognize that much of that human activity that drives climate change comes from the global north, the richest countries of the world. Thirdly, we recognize that it is not just driven by those wealthy nations, but also by the wealthy 1% of those nations whose profit-seeking agenda continues to be at odds with the scientific community's almost unanimous acknowledgement of the need for a drastic overhaul to combat the problem of climate change. So where does the injustice sit? In a nutshell, it is the rich that drives the problem of climate change, but it is the poor, the women, the children, and the marginalized groups who end up having to face the consequences of it. This is where Oxfam comes in, and this is what shapes our understanding of and advocacy around climate justice. We want to bring attention to the kind of justice we're asking for, and that is that wealthy nations that drive climate change need to take responsibility for it. We want them to not just make more commitments, but to see if their current commitments go through, to see their pledges through. We want them to actually commit in action and not just on paper. Climate justice is more than just acknowledging that there is a problem. It's also about owning the climate problem, recognizing that as creators and inheritors of these problems, we need a paradigm shift in national, regional, and global system that is inclusive of and accountable and transparent responsibilities to stop. The recent IPCC report must spur Pacific governments to act together and demand global leaders to build a fairer and greener global economy to ensure the world stays within the 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Therefore, all government leaders need to significantly increase their commitment for adaptation and guarantee justice and survival for the most vulnerable. Now, how do we deal with the impacts in the Pacific? Oxfam's Climate Finance Shadow Report in 2020, released in 2020, last year, it estimated that donors reported $59.5 billion per year on average on climate finance in 2017 and 2018. Now, while the Pacific welcomes increases in the amount of funding for adaptation, Only 25% of climate finance was spent helping countries adapt to the impacts of climate crisis, while the other 66% or 2/3 was spent helping countries cut emissions. If you'd like, we will be able to share the links to these reports with the organizers that could further be shared with you. Now, it clearly shows that the Pacific's plea for urgent support from our international partners has largely been ignored and not prioritized. Despite the overwhelming evidence that small island developing states are already and continuously experience extreme climate-induced disasters in our communities. Climate finance is a lifeline for communities who face the devastating impacts of tropical cyclones, storms, and floods, as well as sea level rise. Therefore, Oxfam's ambition is to ensure that climate finance is adequate, predictable, and accessible. It supports preparedness, adaptation, mitigation, and compensation for loss and damage, especially in the most poor and vulnerable communities, and ensuring gender equality. However, leading developed countries should stop inflating their figures with loans that will or need to be repaid and start increasing grants, especially for the most vulnerable countries to use for adaptation. Now, how can we craft for these affected communities? It is evident that we need progressive, transformative, and accountable systems that will bring about real and rapid climate action. State, non-state, and development partners should urgently transition our economic, social, and ecological system to one that is caring, humane, and just, rather than fueling the endless pursuit of profit and development agenda. We need to support systems that are bottom-up and imposing solutions from the communities. Investment priorities should prioritize building and strengthening functional social protection systems that includes cash, in-kind transfers, social pensions, so that we're able to respond effectively to global crises like the current pandemic that we have, or more localized disasters like tropical cyclones. To conclude, the future depends on the choices we make now. We are at a pivotal point to human history. We cannot return to the brutal, unequal, and unsustainable world. The fight against inequality and the fight for climate justice are the same fight. The pandemic has shown us that massive action by government is possible in the face of a crisis. We must see the same level of action to prevent climate breakdown. Last but not the least, everyone has the right to a just and sustainable world where they can thrive. We believe in a rights-based, transformative approach where everyone has the right to be treated fairly and to have the same rights and opportunities. And to have these, those responsible have to be held accountable. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you so much, Ely. I believe that was really well done, and it calls all of us to action in a way that we have realized and recognized that now is the time, and there's no time to waste anymore. And we look forward to talking a little more with you as we go through the questions and answers. So thank you again. You're very welcome. Our next and final speaker is Linda Siegel, who is the Loss and Damage Advisor from AOSIS. Please help me welcome Linda.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Thank you to Island Innovation for inviting me through the Alliance of Small Island States, which is what AOSIS stands for, to present very briefly on a particular issue around how climate justice is being handled at the international level. And we're going to be looking specifically at loss and damage. What I'd like to do right now is share my screen with you for a brief presentation. Here we are. So I will be looking specifically at loss and damage in small island developing states and how it is dealt with at the international level. We have looked at some really fantastic local and national level examples on this panel. And so I'm kind of pulling up to the international level because addressing these issues needs to be done at each of the different levels, at the international level, at the national level, and certainly at the subnational level. And our speakers have been very eloquent about how that's being done. What I wanted to do, and I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to pull us back to some legal documents or international legal documents, looking at Agenda 21, which was agreed in 1992 at the same time as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed at the same conference. And Agenda 21, which is really the roadmap that parties agreed to in the late 1990s for how to develop sustainably in the 21st century, is very relevant and has a lot of relevant things to say about the special case for small island developing states and for their environment and their development needs. So some of the potential downsides that are presented in Agenda 21 are that small island developing states are ecologically fragile and vulnerable. They have limited land area and small communities, limited resources coupled with the geographic dispersion and isolation from markets, and that they're extremely vulnerable to global warming and sea level rise, with certain small low-lying islands facing the increasing threat of the loss of their entire national territories. This is 1992, it's almost 30 years ago, and these issues were already being recognized in respect of small island developing states. I don't need to bring out the justice issues here. I think they're self-evident. I mean, the upsides, and we've heard other speakers on this panel talk about this, are that the geographic isolation of islands has resulted in the habitation of a comparatively large number of unique species of flora and fauna, giving islands a very high share of global biodiversity, and the rich and diverse cultures in islands have developed special adaptations to island environments and have a store of knowledge of the sound management of island resources. So there's lots of positives mixed in there. What I wanted to do, and this banner across the top comes from the UN Framework Convention Secretariat, and it's looking at how you map losses across individual, society, and environment, and the issues that you need to consider. And what I wanted to do is take Agenda 21 recognition of the special case of SIDS and map that across potential losses in these areas. When we look at individuals, the small population size of islands, the loss of one person or two people in a community as a result of climate impacts, it's very big. The limited resources to do anything about these impacts, and certainly limited land area. There's no room to move. What do you do when sea level encroaches, for example, on your village? Where do you go? Societally, talking about the rich and diverse cultures with special adaptations to island environments, the knowledge of sound management of island resources, but also the threat associated with the speed with which changes are happening, and the threat to those cultures and those management and that knowledge. And finally, from an environmental perspective, the ecological fragility of very rich biodiverse islands, and the vulnerability of those environments to global warming and sea level rise. That's just kind of a little bit of my attempt to do a mapping exercise across the special case for SIDS presented in Agenda 21. I just wanted to, and I know the other speakers have alluded to many of these different impacts, but these are the types of impacts that the international community is aware of and is trying to address at that level. We have extreme weather events, hurricanes and cyclones. These are just a few of them that have happened recently. Irma and Maria, and certainly Maria impacted Puerto Rico, and we heard that earlier in the panel discussion. I haven't put numbers against these extreme weather events because quite often we measure impacts in monetary values, but you can't really do that in a small island developing state context, because a monetary value in a small community or a small economy could throw an island back 20 years in terms of GDP, et cetera. So numbers don't always, monetary values in terms of the level of damage doesn't always mean something when you're talking about islands. We have the threat of slow onset events. Three examples: Kiribati, 2 meters above sea level; the Maldives, 1 meter above sea level; the Republic of the Marshall Islands, 2 meters above sea level. We've heard stories very recently about how the Greenland ice cap, we're seeing land on Greenland for the first time in our memory, in our living history. And when those ice caps begin to melt, that means the sea level is rising. And so there's a direct correlation between climate change and what's happening with temperature rises and the impacts that will have on certainly atoll nations. So, I mean, what does this mean? It means that we need to raise awareness amongst our communities, that we need to gather information from those communities to understand what the impacts really are and how to deal with them. We need to find the right resources to deal with the changes. And we heard certainly from Ile very compellingly about resources in the Pacific and what's available and what that is being spent on. We need to build capacity to access those resources. It's not enough just to have the money. It's how do you get the money and how do you use it. We need to overcome the challenges with the economies of scales. Small islands have small economies. They're not always that interesting to large investors. We need to move fast enough to make a difference, and that's I think the biggest issue is we have about 10 years. That's what the international community is telling us, that we have about 10 years to make a shift and to make a change. And we also need to facilitate the movement of people, because that will become an ever-growing reality, unfortunately, for small island developing states. This is my last slide. I just wanted to kind of orient you in terms of what the international community, international legal process is doing to combat loss and damage. I haven't put in 1991, which was when the small island developing states presented a proposal to set up a fund to deal with sea level rise. It took 20 years. In 2012, there was a recognition that the convention has a role in addressing loss and damage. A mechanism to do that was established a year later in 2013. There's a separate article on loss and damage in the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015. There is a recognition in the legal documentation at the international level that there's a need for international support to address loss and damage, but there are also legal restrictions at that level on findings of liability and provision of compensation. So we're dealing within a limited scope around the loss and damage issue at the international level. That's not to say that that scope cannot be expanded or considered further in the future. This is very quick. It's a complex issue. Thanks so much for your time, and so happy to be part of this really exciting panel. And if you're very interested, there's a series of podcasts that the Alliance of Small Island States has launched called Islands on Alert. So I encourage you to look into that. And thank you very much for your attention. And I will stop sharing my screen and hand it back to Jackie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. And thank you again very much to Fakhri, Ruth, Hernan, Ely, and of course yourself, Linda, for helping us to try to put together some discussion about a lot of the risks and the injustices that we're seeing. We have had a very active chat area, and we also have some questions and answers, which what I'd like to do is simply ask them, and anyone who would like to, if you haven't been identified as an addressed question person, then we can start the conversation here. So here's the first one, and we'll review this live. What can we as a civil society who live on islands do to combat the current climate emergency, and is a new constitution enough? Anyone?
Ruth, Jackie, can I start?
Sure.
Thank you very much. Just want to quick react to that question. I think as a civil society, we need to really start to raise or bring our voice.
Your video, please, so everyone can see you.
Yeah, somehow say it's disabled, cannot start. Is it from there?
Yes, so all speakers can enable their video now.
I'm trying, but somehow not working. Yeah, it's not on. So sorry everyone. So quick react to the to pull our voice together and raise it. And what I'm trying to share is that if I think most of us been in this UNFCCC COP. So if you look there, all the big meeting is consists of all the environment, climate change people, local government people, or a community that's really impacted by the climate change, who sit down there and go into the discussion or this kind of thing, and especially in negotiation. So we need to start using those kind of platform axes to bring our voice. And second, also need to be, as Ely mentions and Ruth mentions, we need to start organize ourselves to show that we do have roles and responsibility, and we do have capacity exist, and we might need resources and more capacity, and somebody should help us. But we have something to start. When we look at Pacific, as I mentioned in the beginning, so those clans, those small provinces in Kiribati, City Council in Vanuatu, Corporation in Tuvalu, have more experience on their island compared to others, but is not well recognized. So that's what I'm trying to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add to what Fakhri just mentioned?
Thanks, Jackie. Yes, I would just like to add, I think everything that Fakhri had said is really true. And I guess for us as civil society, we need to understand our role as, holding the governments to account. That's our role, that the accountability sphere. So let's try and hold our governments to account for what they said that they're going to do for their citizens. And once we'll hold them to account, then we'll be able to hold others to account. And remember the audience or those that you are serving. You are serving the vulnerable, the marginalized, the poor. You're there as their voices. So, let's stop the competition for funding. You know, let's try and relook and rethink, what is my value add? What is my organization's value add in this space that I'm in? Okay, so in the Pacific, you would notice that there are numerous climate financing that is coming into the country. Now, the question now is not about accessibility of climate finance, it's about the effectiveness of climate finance. And how can we make sure that that effectiveness is measured? It can only be measured if we as civil society try to ask the accountability question: where is the money going to? Is it actually reaching those that it's supposed to be reaching? So these are the questions that really needs to be coming out from us and holding others to account for that. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to add to that, and in addition to the governments, I think the companies that are on our islands and different areas also have a very deep responsibility. After all, their stake in our island success is their success. And without acknowledging and bringing into the discussion the responsibility and the accountability and the transparency of not only governments, but also companies that operate in our territories is also really important. Here's another question. It's directed to Ruth. My company was to build a renewable energy system in northern Puerto Rico, but could not achieve a consensus among the government agencies, and the governor would not take control. We were to fund the projects ourselves without government funding or subsidies. So the question is, you know, how do we bring those projects to visibility and to action if there is frustration? And this is not uncommon either. This is not an uncommon situation. So Ruth, you know, what would your comment be to this particular question?
Well, thank you for the question. What we're seeing in Puerto Rico is, I guess what you'd call, the government is paying lip service to renewables and to the transformation of the grid, and doing the opposite, pushing very hard for example, for the FEMA funds and the disaster recovery funding from the federal government to be used for new gas-fired plants, for to rebuild the 20th century transmission and distribution system, centralized transmission and distribution. And what we're proposing, our civil society proposal, known as We Want Sun or Queremos Sol, is that the public utility use those funds that have been allocated to it already by the federal government, especially the FEMA agency, to provide life-saving, resilient rooftop solar and battery energy storage to its clients, especially low and middle income clients that could not otherwise shoulder the burden of upfront costs of rooftop solar and storage. And so I think what we need is pressure by civil society, both in the States and in Puerto Rico, to clamor for the renewable energy projects, especially those that are sited close to or at the point of use, that is rooftop solar and storage.
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much, Ruth. I have a question for Ely. And the question has to do with corporate change makers. So Ely, who are the corporate change makers, or are there successful initiatives among corporations who are leading climate justice?
Thanks, Jackie. Well, in the space of climate change, everyone wants to be in the good books. All corporations would like to be seen as being environmentally friendly, or they go through the environmental safeguarding process to ensure that the standards are conducive to the environment that they're in. But at the same time, But at the same time, we've got to understand that corporations and business are there for a reason, and that's profit making. Okay, so fiduciary systems and safeguarding systems, particularly environmental safeguarding system, really needs to vamp up, and this really needs to be stronger, particularly for island nations, because we have very limited land resources, and we also have our vast ocean resources and our EEZ that we need to protect. Yeah, so we really got to be re-looking outside the box, as much as it's the survival of people that are on land. We also have to be custodians of the survival of marine resources, whom we depend on mostly for our food, for revenue, for islands revenue. So now, for me in particular, it's really critical when we talk with corporations, should not be easily swayed that they are environmentally savvy. Now, there are processes that needs to be followed, and processes not only has to adhere with the global processes, it has to adhere to the government, the national government's processes, or the environmental impact assessment, or whatever processes that we have, environmental safeguarding processes that we have. So for me, again, as an environmentalist, as someone that has worked in this area, we should not be easily swayed. Remember, we do not have the luxury of land, the space that we have. However, we also have the ocean that we need to protect. We are a great ocean state, as we like to be called in the Pacific. And you've got a responsibility for those marine resources to also protect. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you so much. One question that I have, because it particularly as an outgrowth of the pandemic, is the issue of mental wellness. And with so much of the chain that is occurring, and threats and confusion and just continued uncertainty, how does that affect, if anything, climate injustice and social injustice in particular? What is your opinion about how that's affected by mental wellness throughout our society, but particularly in the islands, because we are so closed and so isolated? If anyone would like to take that one.
I would like to say something about that. The experience the experience we've seen from people from the island, it's at the very beginning of the pandemic. It was a very extreme situation because the population of the towns and cities are very low. So the effects were very high and very extreme and very sensitive. So, like, for example, every time they tried, they sort of got to get to control of the situation, so the population would feel that everything was a little bit calm, something would happen that would break the equilibrium of the whole situation because of the very unstable situation. For example, one ship will come with tourists and they will contaminate, they will bring the virus again for the whole population. Or there's salmon agriculture there in some of the fjords, and they bring workers from other parts of the country and bring the virus and will break the equilibrium again. So the feeling in the long-term vision from the people was that they were living like in a roller coaster, with ups and downs, and that really was a big thing for mental stability of the population. The vaccine has become, sort of a major positive effect now that in this territory. But the first year of the pandemic was real bad.
I agree, Hernan, and I think, well, first of all, it's not over. And I think a lot of, how shall we say, a lot of our communities in the very beginning, we were very in some cases, very united against the fight. We were very united against this demon, if you will. But now there's not that unity that there used to be. And there is a sense that some, very similar to climate justice, you know, the richer nations are getting all the vaccines and those that are less wealthy are not. And how does that affect our overall justice system when there are some that are in no capacity or not able at all to get the health and assistance that they need? So I'm wondering among the five of you how you might preview this and forecast, if you want to take a stab at it, how this is going to be part of a greater discussion as we move on. I'll just leave it at that.
Jackie, maybe I can add a little bit to that. We've got to understand that as Pacific Islanders, we are very unique. We have our own coping mechanisms. We have the family unit, the Wuvale, we call it in Fiji. And we have our extended family units that we rely on. Now, in terms of the mental status, let's keep this in mind. Before the pandemic struck, climate change and its impact in the Pacific was already there. And we should never lose focus, even with the pandemic. Here in the Pacific, we are going through a double disaster, and it could even triple, okay? So we cannot lose sight of one to take another one up. No, it does not work that way here in the Pacific. We need to acknowledge that climate change has been there, and we will continue to fight. We will continue to fight, and we will continue to be resilient people as we move along on this fight for climate justice. And now with the pandemic coming on board, we are shouldering the burden. We're shouldering the burden. Hence why I've said in my speech, let us try and own the problem. The moment we say, yes, we are a contributor, whether we're in the Pacific or whether we're in a developed nation, the moment things will change and you will take action because you know you're responsible for it, okay? So for us in the Pacific, I guess we're only as strong because we have each other's back. We have each other's back. We walk the talk, and you can also see that with the IPCC that is coming, with the COP, the commitments of the nationally determined contributions and so forth. The Pacific countries have been one of the first that have been doing the submissions of these reports. That's, you know, we are not responsible or are the least responsible for these disasters, but we are the first. And why is that? It's because we're owning that problem and we're taking action to move forward. So in terms of, let's talk about the mental status. Remember, it's not only the pandemic that is hitting us hard. Climate change was there from the beginning. Okay, so we're just shouldering. It's an extra burden that is coming through, but the Pacific will continue to fight. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Linda, I have a question for you. What is your feeling regarding any significant advancement of the loss and damage agenda at COP26?
Okay, I don't have a crystal ball, but I've been in the international process for many years. And one thing I think that we need to understand is that the international process is based on consensus, and it's not a voting system, certainly not in the Climate Change Convention process. It's based on consensus, and you have a multiplicity of different interests across not just developed and developing countries, but certainly within the developing world as well, in terms of priorities. So getting to any form of agreement and pushing change at the international level takes many, many years. Like I said, AOSIS presented a proposal on sea level rise in 1991 when the UNFCCC was being negotiated. The convention itself, and it took 20 years to recognize that the convention actually had a role in addressing loss and damage. So change is very slow. That said, loss and damage is one of the issues that's on the agenda for COP26, and there are a number of issues that are going to be discussed. And I believe we're in a strange time also at the international level from the pandemic standpoint, because none of us have been able to meet with each other for nearly two years. And that hinders the ability to kind of negotiate properly. So that said, there are loss and damage issues on the agenda, and there's certainly positivity around good outcomes for moving forward. But it's never a done deal. It's something that is an iterative process that we have to work through as we go along. So a good outcome is not necessarily the end game. A good outcome is something that will lead to further good outcomes going forward in the international process. So without getting into too many specifics and talking about country or regional positions, that's what I would say about what we have to look forward to around loss and damage at COP26. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda. Definitely time at this point is not really on our side. But here's another question, and anyone who would like to answer it. Encroaching sea level rise will eventuate with breaches to the integrity of our island's oceanic jurisdictions. On which platform do we seek climate justice? Big question.
Can I just come in very briefly? And I tried to bring this out in my very short presentation. We need to look at all different levels, and my entry point really is the international level, and I work with island states and governments at that level and have for many years. But international law is implemented at the national and subnational level, and you know, responsibilities are different at different levels. But I think we need to attack it at every level. And thanks to Ely for bringing up the oceans issue, because that's a huge piece of the whole climate change debate. It's only really actually being discovered under the Climate Change Convention itself. But it's not one place or another place. It's all places, and everyone has a role to play. And I'm so happy to be on a panel of people who are actually implementing things at the national level. But there's a role for global debate as well, because it's a global problem. So I would say there's not a one-stop shop. It's every shop that we have to be engaged in, and to the best of our abilities, and where we can be engaged is where we should be engaged. Great.
Thank you again, Linda. Go ahead. I'm
Jackie,
sorry.
I can just quick add to Linda. That is very true. I just want to echo, this is not a matter of choice what platform. I think how best we can use all platforms in terms of platform talking about policy, platform talking about system, platform talking about resources, capacity. We need to tap to all of that. And then let's say UNFCCC, we talk about policy, we negotiate all of those kind of things. That's a global movement. But then the island issues is very specific, localistic, and then very, very small. So can small island together in whatever platform try to discuss and find a specific option of solution? And that can be a local solution for global issues. So Linda is very true. We should not pick one. We should put all the effort, go to every level. But the important one, as Eileen mentioned in the beginning, we should really own the problem. So we're not playing as somebody who need help. We're playing as the one who do things for ourselves in order to tackle this. Thank you.
If anyone else would like to add to the comments of Linda and Fakhri.
Thanks, Jackie. Maybe I'll just add a little bit further. One of the things that Oxfam in the Pacific is actually moving towards to now, and it's trying to strengthen, is the notion of multi-stakeholder partnership approach. This is really critical because we cannot go solo now. We need the efforts of multiple partners coming together for a common goal. And we're going to continue to strive to work with partners. Let's put aside our differences, okay? So let's put all that aside. We've got 2 major disasters before us now. Let's come together. Let's work together. We've heard it's easier said than done, because I've heard this. I've been in COP meetings. It's the 26th COP that is coming up. So 26 years of debating about working together, action now, and so forth. But it's time that we put our differences aside and start coming together. Bring in the partners, bring in the indigenous people, bring in the women, bring in the youths. Let them sit at the table to talk about matters that concerns them more. Let's bring in the mothers because they have the care of duty for their children, for the elders. Let's bring in the people with disabilities. We need to hear their stories. That needs to go into decision making, policy making. So let's bring everyone along with us on this. So for that, I would leave on that notion, Jackie, multi-stakeholder partnership approach is the way forward to combating climate change, and it's the way forward for climate justice. Thank you.
You know, that's very interesting, because one of the questions addresses that specifically, and I'll just go ahead and review it. Has anyone on the panel explored collaboration across local to local, e.g. indigenous and indigenous networks that may circumvent some of the bottlenecks of hierarchical governmental systems, leveraging shared values and capacities existing and co-created across climate vulnerable communities in small island states? I think this is exactly what you're saying, and that is, you know, include those that are generally not included and actually may be disfavored, if you will, among the traditional networks of decision making and power. If someone would like to respond to that.
Yeah, I can add something there. What we are proposing is a civil society coalition in the We Want Sun proposal, Queremos Sol, in Puerto Rico, is precisely including stakeholders that are usually excluded from the conversation about the energy system. Communities, especially environmental justice communities that are impacted by the centralized fossil-fired generation system that we have. But we also include academia. We also include the labor unions at the electric company. Even beyond that, the University of Puerto Rico, especially at the Maya West campus, has spearheaded historically efforts to create these stakeholder groups that include a large swath of civil society in Puerto Rico. So I totally agree with what Illy and others have said about multi-party and sector stakeholder, not just conversations, but decision-making processes. And that's the way that we would be able to transform these systems that do not serve the public interest and that in fact are impacting public health, environmental resources, and the climate in general.
Would anyone like to add to that as well? I think those that have been either underserved or certainly not included are definitely important opinions and stakeholders that need to be included. If anyone else would like to add to that.
Jackie, sorry, just one quick, as Illy mentioned, everyone to be in, but I think it's also a part of everyone, very important to have private investment, businesses. Because we know from Addis Ababa agenda, all those kind of things, we realize public investment is not enough to do this. Public finance is just not enough. Grants is just not enough. Where the money from? Private investment. if private investment is not aligned with all this strategy, then we are fighting huge dinosaurs. So they need to be a part. And then how to initiate a blended finance as part of the finance partnership. How private investment understand the island strategy, where they want to go, but they can do business inside that strategy. And then that strategy is achieving the island development in the future. So that's kind of blended finance will help islands so much. Otherwise, we keep depend ourselves on the grants, ODA, public finance, well, it's never enough. I think privates need to be with us. Thanks.
Is there anyone who would like?
Yeah, I would like to just say a short thing. I agree with all the things that have been said about this question now, but I will just include two topics that we are working with on the island. One is that the strategy to include people now is behind the climate the climate emergency declaration, that it's been making the conditions so where we can put everyone together, and at the regional level, the national level, and the local level, the communities and the indigenous people, because the declaration is not a pure declaration, but at the same time includes, you know, the task to build up a plan. And the declaration also includes all the groups of society that has to be a part of the managing of the plan. And we made sure when we wrote that, we helped writing down that declaration that everyone will be included: the youth, the indigenous people, the workers, the mothers, the universities, the students, and the private sector and the public sectors in all the levels.
Thank you. There was one question, I think to kind of bring this to a circle that's addressed to Ely, but everyone else can certainly come in on this. As the move is to bring all of the stakeholders to the table, how do you facilitate discussions and drive actions? And what will this look like? Because there's such diversity and difference. There's so many differences now. How do you bring them all together so that as a unified group, more can be done as opposed to just to continue to talk and say that we need unity?
Thank you, Jackie. For those of you that are in doubt about how effective would be a multi-stakeholder approach will look like, let me reassure you, I'm the project manager of a project that has made this successful. So I work with the Solomon Islands Climate Action Network and the Vanuatu Climate Action Network. And if you want to understand a little bit more of what multi-stakeholder partnership is about, these two networks have really done good jobs in able to bring in the private sector, to bring in the mothers, the market vendors, the government, to all sit in a room, to sit together and discuss an issue that is of relevance to them. Now, if you've heard in my speech, I've said, let's put our differences aside, okay? As the private sector, profit making, let's park that for a while, okay? And then there's other multiple issues that we have within our own selves. Now, why these two networks have become really effective is that we've all brought them to speak on one common issue. And what is that issue? The issue is the impact, because climate change and climate impacts is affecting everyone, regardless of which sector you're in. If it's the private sector, it's affecting you. So come with your private sector knowledge and see how can we work together with other stakeholders that are in the room to ensure that you're able to profit in the place that you're working in. And how can you bring your technology, your knowledge to be able to inform the way that schools are built? You know, so when we talk about category 3 or category 5 cyclone-proofing schools or houses, bring in those are the things that we want to hear, and that's what government wants to hear. And government comes in and say, look, we've been very weak in terms of trying to get civil society to come and talk to us about how things. This is the platform. Okay, and what Oxfam does is Oxfam comes in only as a broker, a facilitator, and a convener. We do not come and decide. We let them, we open up the space, we let them speak and talk about a common issue that is affecting them. And that's through that, it has started to expand. So you know whom to contact. It's no longer the government. It's no longer the private sector. It's no longer the market vendor. You know, when you have a problem, you've got their phone numbers right there on your hand. I'm going to call up my friend at the private sector and I'm just going to ask them, what do they have about this? And then conversation happens. Now, having that, we've got working groups established. We've got climate finance working group established. We've got loss and damage working group established. And everyone takes part in those working groups. We invite the private sector to sit in our working group. And they in turn invite us to sit in their board working group. So you could see the exchange of information have started to filter through. So it's no longer, it's no more me, myself, and I, and me wanting to thrive in this area. It's no longer like that here in the Pacific. It's about how can I ensure that my brothers in the Solomon Islands, in Vanuatu, in Tonga, in Samoa, how can we ensure that we battle this beast together? So if you're in doubt, I'll challenge you. It's already working here in the Pacific. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone want to comment before we summarize and wrap up? I think a very important message that we're learning, first of all, thank you to Hernan, Fakri, Ruth, Ely, and Linda for joining us, and most importantly to the organizers of this very important discussion. Clearly, the islands have been on the forefront of what has been happening climate-wise, socially, and environmentally. And I think the simple message is this: learn from us. Learn from us. Bring us to the table. Ask us what we've learned, and we are in a position to share with you. Not necessarily to be the recipients of advice and recommendations, because we have been here for decades. We have experienced many of the situations that are now being seen worldwide, and islands can be just a source of wonderful, wonderful information, and our stories are translatable throughout the rest of the world. So as islands being living labs, join with us as we go through the next many years, because this is an important conversation that doesn't have to be with the main individuals, but primarily with so many of the different islanders who have been at the forefront of change and the forefront of learning, because we have much to share with you. So again, thank you to the organizers. Thank you to the speakers. You have really raised so much in the way of great conversation, and we look forward to seeing you at the next summit. So thank you again.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you,